Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare, perhaps the most problematic of all the Shakespearean problem plays. This one is a puzzler and one of William Shakespeare's least popular works, and I can sort of understand why, because it seems as though no one really knows exactly what to make of this play. However, in spite of that, or perhaps because of it, I actually think that this may be one of Shakespeare's most quietly brilliant works. So, what is Troilus and Cressida about? Well, it is set during the latter days of the Trojan War and concerns, among other things, the love affair between a young Trojan prince named Troilus, a younger son of King Priam, and a young Trojan maiden named Cressida. They fall madly in love, or think they do, until, however, they sadly come to realize that true love may not be as true as one would like to think it is. That's kind of just the main gist of it as I can give it succinctly, because there is a lot going on in this play. However, as I said earlier, no one really knows exactly what to make of this play, and it is very difficult to categorize. It is often lumped in with the tragedies, although it doesn't really fit that bill as cleanly as the other works that are commonly listed as tragedies. It is often considered a comedy as well. However, it doesn't really fit that any more neatly. But as for me, that is why it's called a problem play after all. But as for me, I think it is more or less a tragedy, just not in the same sense as like Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth. It is a different beast altogether, though I think the ultimate takeaway is one of tragedy. And plus, we have to analyze what is meant by Shakespearean tragedy. The common definition of what constitutes a tragedy in Shakespeare's body of work is a play that moves from order to disorder. Conversely, the comedies are generally considered to be works that move from disorder to order. That is to say, at the beginning of every tragedy, things are relatively stable, but then they begin to break apart and crumble over the course of the story. That is kind of the main thrust of what a Shakespearean tragedy is usually considered to be. And Troilus and Cressida, I think, does fit in there, if only just barely, because it does start out fairly orderly and things do crumble and decay over the course of the story that the play tells. But, as I said, I believe that this may actually be one of Shakespeare's most quietly and unassumingly brilliant works. And it is absolutely, I think, the most modern work that he ever wrote. In fact, I may go so far as to say that this is not even modern, but postmodern. I really do think that this may be a very early example of postmodernism, and I will explain why. So, the play is set in the latter days, as I said, of the Trojan War, and it can be read as something of a companion piece or spin-off, if you will, to Homer's original The Iliad. While the basic trajectory of events is more or less the same, and the characters are pretty much the same. You have Achilles, Hector, Ajax, all the warriors and what have you. While all that's pretty much the same, it is the tone that is radically different and very, very irreverent to this source material. But I think that is where the genius really lies, and why this kind of resonates, or at least it did with this reader, still today, because there is something distinctly modern, or perhaps postmodern, about this. So the play is concerned, as I elaborated upon, it is principally concerned with the love affair between Troilus and Cressida. However, this is not your conventional love story a la Romeo and Juliet. This is actually something of an inversion of that Shakespeare work. I really think this is like a more bitter and cynical and jaded version of Shakespeare's own Romeo and Juliet. However, while I said that this is considered, um, that I consider this at least to be a tragedy, it is, if we accept it as such, it is the only work of Shakespeare's that can be considered a tragedy in which the titular characters do not die. Troilus and Cressida actually make it through this story. However, it is not the lovers that die in this story, but rather the love itself that meets its end. And that's kind of the point. The What this play is really about is, it's very satirical, and it basically kind of seeks to undermine the classic and heroic story of the Iliad by poking holes in some of the most sacrosanct characters and one of the most sacrosanct texts of Western literature. And it is because of that, again, that I think this really feels like something modern. If you can get around the language, there is a very modern feeling story to be had here. So, Troilus and Cressida fall madly in love, or think that they do. However, after Cressida is offered up as a prisoner exchange with the Greeks in order to get back one of Troy's most prized captains, she quickly proves rather fickle and proceeds to kind of flirt with and toy with one of the Greek captains, Diomedes. And Troilus does not like this. And he gets pissed. And it's through the lens of Troilus that Shakespeare is kind of trying to show us, I think, that nothing is fail proof. Nothing is infallible, even something that we think of usually as so sacred and holy as love. It can still, and all too often does, fail. And so, what this play ultimately becomes about is the fall of ideals, not just in the crumbling of the love between Troilus and Cressida, but also because everything else that about the story of the Iliad that is taken to be so sacred and so renowned and extolled is just brutally and ruthlessly undercut by Shakespeare in this play. And it becomes something of a very black tragicomedy because it is funny. And one of the most genius aspects of this play is what Shakespeare has done with the character of Thersites. So, in the original Iliad, there is a very brief um, mention of a character named Thersites, and he is kind of this. He is a Greek character who is not really on board so much, I think, with the war, and he kind of belly aches. And I have not read the Iliad as of this time myself, so I'm just going off of what I have read of this character and his role in that story. But in the Iliad, as I'm given to understand it, Thersites there just shows up in one brief scene and kind of belly aches about the war and the state of things before he is called down and chastised by the more heroic and upstanding characters. However, what Shakespeare has done here is taken that minor character of Thersites from Homer's original and transformed him into a Shakespearean fool. Now, if you don't know what the Shakespearean fool is, in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, he would have the character of a fool, who is usually kind of a lower class commoner type character who is nonetheless imbued with a great degree of biting and very sarcastic wit with which he kind of just cuts down to size all the other main characters of the play. The most famous example of the Shakespearean fool comes from King Lear. The fool character in that play is utterly merciless with his wit and his tongue. But he is certainly my favorite aspect of that play, and I think he's one of the most memorable. But what Shakespeare does in Troilus and Cressida with Thersites is turn him into something of a Shakespearean fool. And this guy just cuts everyone down to size in this. He has a mouth on him like you wouldn't believe, and he constantly just belittles and just makes fun of all the other characters in this play that we typically think of as heroic and dashing and courageous like Achilles and Patroclus. Now, in the original Homeric epic of the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus are lovers. I believe so. If not explicitly, then implicitly they are lovers. And that kind of thing wouldn't have raised any kind of an eyebrow in ancient Greece because homosexuality was common back then. However, in Shakespeare's day, that was not the case. And so we get kind of a flipping of the dynamic there, whereas in the original um, poem of the Iliad, Achilles is this really honorable and upstanding and courageous and valiant warrior. In this, he's kind of just this bohemian figure who gets constantly made fun of by Thersites at the expense of his homosexuality with Patroclus. And I know that might not ring so well with modern audiences, the characters being made fun of because they're gay, but if you can kind of get down with what Shakespeare's trying to do and kind of forgive him because of given the era and whatnot. There is some fun to be had here just because Thersites' tongue and his wit are so ruthless, and he just constantly cuts everyone down to size. But it's also through Thersites that Shakespeare takes pot shots at the very Trojan War itself, which in Greek mythology is this grand sprawling conflict that is a very important and central story to their mythology. And here Shakespeare just says, no, nah, this was retarded and unnecessary because Thersites is all like, y'all are a bunch of dumbasses fighting over this woman who's not worth it. And it's really just, again, it's very modern sounding and very funny because this play is so concerned with just poking fun at things that are up to that point, I guess, were considered just so untouchable. Because the story of the Trojan War and the Iliad are foundational. It's a foundational text of Western culture, and during Shakespeare's day, there was a lot of interest in that because a lot of its values have been carried down into Shakespeare's culture and into ours. But Shakespeare really proved himself ahead of his time with Troilus and Cressida by undermining all of that and calling it out from a different angle. And again, I really do think this is a very early example of postmodernism because postmodernism is a movement, socio literary artistic movement that is concerned with deconstruction and questioning, very vigorous questioning uh, of previous of staunchly held values and beliefs, and it's about questioning those and kind of picking them apart. And this is what Shakespeare does with this. I think there is a very clear link between Troilus and Cressida and like the works of Thomas Pynchon. I really do think that there you can kind of see a thread connecting the two because this is both gleefully scornful and sarcastic, and also the works of Thomas Pynchon are kind of that way too. It deals with kind of somber topics in a facetious and non-serious way, and that's why it's so hard to categorize this because it deals with war and there are deaths in this, although not exactly how they happen in the original epic. In the original epic, the death of Hector by Achilles is a great one-on-one combat where Achilles bests him and slays him in a duel. And not so here. In again, Shakespeare is trying to jerk the rug out from under us with our preconceptions of this story because here Achilles is vastly more low and cowardly, and he does not fight Hector in the same manner that he does in the Iliad. In fact, he doesn't fight him at all. He has his myrmidons gang up on Hector and then stab him while he is unarmed and unarmored. So it's not glorious or valiant in the slightest. And it kind of has an anti-war vibe to it by just how ignoble and base these events are portrayed through Shakespeare's lens. Whereas in the original poem, they are extolled and really praised. Shakespeare, again, is just, cutting them off at the knees and saying, nah, not quite as noble and laudable as you think it is. But the reason why it's so hard to categorize is because the tone veers wildly in this work. It starts out um, pretty kind of bawdy. There's a lot of sexual innuendo in here and sex jokes, and again, a lot of jokes at the expense of Achilles and Patroclus's sexuality. But um, it morphs in back and forth between the light and the heavy. Again, the comedy is kind of omnipresent, except in certain areas. It's kind of comparable, actually, to Joseph Heller's Catch 22. You know, that book is known for being very comedic and satirical, except when you get to like the last 50 or so pages of that book, it is downright hellish. This is kind of likenable to that because it starts off kind of raunchy, like a sex comedy with lots of, sex jokes and everything. But then when it gets to the war parts, it gets kind of darker, and then there's always that kind of pall that hangs over it whenever Troilus sees the love of his life being unfaithful. And then at the end, when Hector is unceremoniously, ganged up on and killed, it gets dark. And that's why it's so hard for people to conclusively categorize this in Shakespeare's body of work because it doesn't really fit easily with any one thing. Um, I consider it to be, yes, a tragedy because ultimately it comes to a conclusion of disorder, and it's about the crumbling of values and beliefs and suppositions. But again, the titular characters here don't actually die, which is a uniqueness to the play. But then it's also really funny, but then it's not funny enough to really be a full on comedy. So it's kind of just this redheaded stepchild kind of thing that no one really knows what to make of. But I think it really is a work of quiet brilliance. Now, I will not say that it is perfect. I don't think it is. The major uh, drawback here, the major shortcoming, is the ending to me, or rather the lack thereof, because this doesn't really have an ending. It just kind of stops. And I don't get the impression that Shakespeare really had a goal that he was building to in his mind when he was writing this. I think he was just trying to write something with 5 acts, but he didn't really have a set conclusion in mind. All of Shakespeare's tragedies seem to build to something. Macbeth builds towards his own undoing. Hamlet builds towards that, bloodbath in that play's finale. Antony and Cleopatra builds towards their deaths and that kind of thing. But this doesn't really build to anything. There really is no ending to this. It ends with Hector being, again, very unceremoniously killed by not by Achilles himself, but rather by his myrmidons. And then it just kind of stops. It just ends with no real resolution. It's just odd, and that's the real weakness here. I think is that there really was no goal in mind, or I don't get the feeling that there was, and so it has kind of an unsatisfactory ending. But other than that, I think it's actually a really good play. I would give this a B plus. I would rank this really highly in Shakespeare's oeuvre myself, even though I recognize that a lot of other people wouldn't. But yeah, I think it's just really sharp, very modern. Once again, it's, I think, probably the most modern thing that Shakespeare ever wrote, and perhaps the work of his that was the most ahead of its time. Um, I think there's a lot of fun that modern readers can get out of it that perhaps Shakespeare's own contemporary readers and viewers may not have gotten. And so, for that reason, I can really recommend it. So, yes, Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare. Have you read Troilus and Cressida or seen it performed? Which I doubt because this is not performed very often because it is one of Shakespeare's least popular works. But if you have read it or seen it, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I have said about it here today. And if you haven't read Troilus and Cressida, I would really recommend it. Again, it's not perfect and it's different from basically, I guess, everything else that Shakespeare wrote. But I think it's really valuable. It has a lot to offer, and I think it really is kind of flawed genius. I really do. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button, subscribe. I would really appreciate it if you did. And until next time, peace.